As the great philosopher Arthur Reed once said,
Having fun isn't hard when you've got a library card.
And those words have never been more true than in this year of 2025, where everything is more expensive and most of us are still massively underpaid. But the library continues to be free. If you pay municipal taxes, you've already paid for all their services, so why not go use them? Library propagandizing aside, last year I got back into reading for fun a lot more, something I hadn't really done in years. This year I wanted to read even more because doing that made me rediscover that, yeah, actually, I do like reading for fun. That thing I used to do as a hobby as a kid and teen to the point where my mom had to take books out of my bedroom so I would actually get dressed in the morning. Yeah, I still like that. Wild. Anyway, something neat my local public library does, not one of the ones I work at, I should be clear here. Something they do is what they call adult activity kits. Every month you sign up and get a bunch of free stuff. Mostly it's like recipes, craft ideas, coloring pages, word searches, and materials promoting the library's collection and programs. It's fun, it's easy, and it's free. I think they started doing them during the lockdowns a few years ago, but they proved popular, so they just kept doing them. I want to steal the idea and use it at my own work, but unfortunately I can't for reasons that are too dumb and boring to go into. The other thing they give you in these kits is a surprise library book. You pick a genre from a pretty extensive list, and they choose a book at random off the shelves to check out to you for 3 weeks. This was honestly the thing that made me the most excited. Obviously, I have a huge TBR list already. I work in 2 public libraries. I am constantly seeing what other people bring back or what's getting added to the new shelf and doing some mild snooping. But I liked the idea of someone else picking something for me to read because I reasoned that it would likely be stuff I'd never heard of or otherwise wouldn't seek out on my own. They also do book bundles where you pick a genre and they give you 5 to 7 books in that genre. But I'm going to be honest, I don't read that fast anymore, so 1 book a month seemed reasonable. That way I'd still be able to pick up other books here and there. I decided to try it out for the first 6 months of the year and see what I got out of it. Every month, I asked them to choose a fantasy novel for me. The results were, well, the results. Well, let's talk about those results. As with my 2024 book journal video, I'd like to do a couple little disclaimers. Number 1, this video will contain spoilers, subjective opinions, and general criticism. If there's a book here that you'd like to read unspoiled, please feel free to skip that section of the video. Discussion of each book will be contained solely to their own sections, though they might be mentioned briefly in other sections. It's okay if we have different opinions on something. If I hated something that you loved, or vice versa, that's not a personal attack, and I'm not coming for you specifically. But if I didn't like a book, I'm not going to be quiet about why. I won't be quiet about why if I did like something either. I try to stay as fair as possible. Number 2, content warnings. Each book is different and has different levels of content warnings necessary. If I believe a book warrants content warnings, I will put them at the start of each section, both verbally and on screen. That doesn't necessarily mean I'll be discussing the content in the warnings every time in the video. The warnings are for the books themselves in case you're planning on seeking them out on your own. But yes, if a content warning comes up, it's fair to assume we'll be discussing that topic. Alright, with the housekeeping out of the way, let's get started. January, The Lost Story by Meg Schaefer. Content warnings for child abuse and homophobia. So, starting off with an absolute wild card. I'd never heard of this book or this author before I picked up my kit, but the premise intrigued me. 15 years ago, 2 teenage boys disappeared in the woods for months, only to turn up again largely unscathed. Flash forward to the present, and now one is a reclusive artist who lives on his own in the woods, and the other is a minor celebrity missing persons investigator. A young woman comes asking for help finding her sister who disappeared when she was a baby, and they wind up returning to the magical otherworld to find her. It wears its Narnia inspiration on its sleeve, and as someone who grew up reading at least most of those books, I never finished the back half of the series, I could appreciate that. Unfortunately, Oh my god, holy shit. This book would be a solid mid-tier 2.5 stars without the big problem, which we'll get to. It's marketed as an adult fairy tale, but reads more like YA. I've often said that the new adult genre is just young adult for people who aren't ready to give up YA, but don't want to be seen reading books for teenagers. And this is that. This is 100% that. Everything is so juvenile. I'm staring at Jeremy and Rafe and going, "You are in your 30s," every time they open their mouths. Not that I've never met an immature 30-something. I'm 32. I know what my peer group is like. But wow. Everything these characters say is just the exact kind of dumbassery I hear from 16-year-olds at work. Like I said, juvenile. And it's not even that just them. They just get the most screen time, so they're the most noticeable. Everyone in this book talks like the worst MCU snarkfest dialogue that you can think of. It's embarrassing. The two female leads, Emily and Shannon, are the other two that get the brunt of this issue. No, it's actually not cute that you call your long-lost younger sister, who's 23, even if she talks like she's 10 years younger, Brat, as a supposedly affectionate nickname. I also got the ick from Jeremy calling Emily Princess almost immediately after meeting her. I don't care that there was an in-universe reason for it eventually. She told him to stop, and he didn't, and I hate that. The enforced nickname trope is one of my least favorites. That's not my fucking name. Anyway, it's not just the dialogue that's the problem here, though it's the big thing contributing to the juvenile feeling. The characters also don't interact like real people for the most part. Jeremy and Rafe were way too taken with Emily far too quickly, and it didn't feel like a genuine bond like I assume the author must have been going for. I liked Rafe's mom, for the most part, for what little she was in the book. Rafe himself was also alright. He and his thought process and his trauma were, I thought, well written and good to read about. I empathized with him. Emily, our other POV character, I cared for less, because she was generally written much more childishly than Rafe was. But even so, I didn't hate being in her head like I did Glinda from It's Not a Cult. Shannon was nothing. She had about as much characterization as the big good character in your average Precure season, but with more sex jokes, I guess. I had been invested in finding out her deal, right up until we actually met her, and I decided I didn't care anymore. She's boring, sorry. Jeremy, though. Oh my god. What a smarmy jackass. We're supposed to like him? Hello? I was kind of invested in his relationship with Rafe, but more for Rafe's sake than his. I'll admit, his one and only POV chapter was one of my favorites in the whole book, but a lot of the time I found him to be a kind of I know better than you dipshit. And the book wants you to find him funny, but like I said, he's just rude or childish or both depending. Which is wild, given that his whole thing is supposed to be that he's the only one who remembers the magical otherworld and therefore is wise beyond his years or whatever. Fucking magical horses are whores for berries. Shut the fuck up. Explode. Speaking of Jeremy and Rafe's relationship, well, I'm not going to pretend teenagers never have sex. I didn't, but as asexual's George, I'm an outlier and shouldn't have been counted. But I knew even when I was in high school, around the same time as Rafe and Jeremy would have been, that kids in my classes had sex. But it's weird how much emphasis they put on the fact that the two of them not only got into a relationship, fine, normal, but also spent a lot of time banging. Also fine, but weird how much attention is drawn to it. Obviously, there's no on-page underage sex, or sex of any kind. It's not that kind of book. But it feels like the way Meg Schaefer decided to make this a fairy tale for adults specifically is to have people swear and talk about sex all the time. Hate that. Again, childish. An immature idea of what adulthood means. The other thing that got to me here was the whole bit where Emily and Jeremy talk about sexuality. She figures out that he and Rafe were dating, but that Rafe has forgotten it along with everything else about Shenandoah, and asks if he's gay. Jeremy says that Rafe is straight except for me, which is a choice? And then Emily asks Jeremy if he's gay or straight or just fun at parties, which, wow! Meg, you're bisexual yourself! You should know better than to portray bisexuality in this way! Fucking hell! And then there's also Emily. I think the authorial intent here is to portray her as an asexual, perhaps one who doesn't know the word yet. Normally, I'd love that, being ace myself. But the way she expresses it, saying, I don't want boobs or dicks in my face, just, again, this character is in her 20s. Moving on. The magical otherworld is called Shenandoah, which, as a Canadian, made me immediately go, like, from the John Denver song. I'm not joking, Take Me Home Country Roads is the only reason I've even heard of the Shenandoah River, let alone know that it's in West Virginia. Apparently, it's spelled wrong, also. This is something I don't care about. Sorry, Americans, I don't know shit about your geography, and I refuse to learn. Tell me what province Vancouver is capital of without looking it up, and we'll talk. As a magical otherworld, Shenandoah is just kind of whimsical fluff. There's nothing there. It has no teeth. I get that that's meant to be the appeal, I guess, and the late game twist that it was originally made up by a child makes that make some sense. But Narnia was about something. Good old Clive Staples had thoughts and ideas about his own religion, and wrote Narnia to be about it in various ways. Shenandoah is trying to be about escapism, running away from the real world to a place that's really truly good. And it tries, but it's just not very interesting to read about. When the Bright Boys first got brought up, I thought maybe it was trying to do something with the idea that a world built on the idea of stories still has to have bad guys, but they just weren't really much of anything. Easily dispatched mooks, for the most part. Once the heroes got what they needed from them, they were largely ignored for the rest of the book. Right, and the West Virginia setting. It was fine. Not something I really cared about one way or another. My main knowledge of West Virginia is that it's east for some reason, the McElroys are from there, and it's a generally conservative area, I think. Do y'all actually do the West, by God, Virginia thing they do in this book, or is Meg Schaefer just making shit up? That's not real, right? This is a Canadian say A after every sentence thing, right? Honestly, the book was weirdly paced, too. We spent so long in West Virginia that by the time we actually got to Shenandoah, the book was half over, and then we dove right into the part with the Bright Boys and their town and Rafe's dad. I mean, I did like the showdown with Rafe's dad. I thought the emotional impact of that whole thing was excellently done. He doesn't care about anything else, he just doesn't want his own crimes and the full extent of his abuse to come to light. Genuinely, for all my complaints, I did like that. I thought it was weird that it came like 2/3 of the way through. It didn't feel like end of Act 2 material. This is climactic stuff, right? But no, the book drags its shambling corpse of an ending out so long. Once Rafe's dad is defeated, Rafe regains his memories of his first time in Shenandoah, and then the book stumbles along through the back third or so. We get an explanation why Shenandoah is the way it is. Shannon made it up as a kid and more or less stumbled into it. Which is fine, I guess, but again, the world is toothless and uninteresting because it was, in universe, made up by a child. Children have great imaginations, yeah, but not like interesting ones. Sorry, they're not going to make up a world that's particularly robust. We also learn the twist that Shenandoah can only be entered 3 times, because Shannon was a child when she made it up, and that's the kind of thing a child making up a fairy tale thinks is cool and interesting, apparently. So if any of them leave, they can never come back. Okay. Neat. Anyway, then there's a long celebration of defeating the Bright King, or whatever the fuck Rafe's dad was calling himself, and we fuck around for a little while. Literally, haha, I'm so clever. And then Jeremy gets shot. It's meant to be a clever callback to a thing that happened earlier with one of the Bright Boys, but it's ultimately unimportant, and immediately undermined by Rafe knocking the Bright Boy into the river, water being the only thing that can kill them outright, and he has this dumbass swiper no-swiping, aw man moment, like, just totally sucked tension from the scene. God, it was stupid. So Rafe decides to take Jeremy back to West Virginia because Shenandoah being made up by a child means they don't have things like hospitals, but that means neither of them will ever be able to come back. It's kind of a sad moment, and I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of intrigued to see whether they'd actually kill one of the main characters off. But no, it's not that kind of book. I'm not exactly upset about that, to be clear. I think just straight up killing Jeremy off would have been incongruous with the tone and themes of the entire rest of the book. The whole thing leads up to, honestly, what I feel was an incredibly strong ending. Jeremy is saved, he and Rafe move into Rafe's art cabin or whatever, they start trying to figure out what to do from now on. It's sweet, honestly, and kind of relatable. Not that I've ever been to a magical otherworld with magic golden apples or whatever, but I have been a listless 30-something who just lost the thing that defined them for several years. For Rafe and Jeremy, that was Shenandoah. For me, it was my job. In the 2 years between getting laid off by the school board and getting the public library jobs I have now, I was in a fucking state. Multiple people have commented to me that I seem happier now that I'm doing my real job again and not working a minimum wage retail job. But in that time in between, I was restless, depressed, trying to make the most of things and worried that I'd never be truly happy again. So, I related to Rafe and Jeremy here is what I'm getting at. And then, while hanging out in the woods, as they do sometimes, they come across their horses. The magical ones, that are whores for berries. Understandably, they're incredibly confused what they're doing here. Thankfully, Emily has provided them with a handy note explaining that she and Shannon are working on a new story, new magic that might be able to get them back into Shenandoah. Excited, the two of them go off to start preparing to return again to their true home, and that's where the book ends. Genuinely, I loved that. I hope to God Meg Schaefer doesn't write a sequel, not because I didn't like this book, although I didn't, but because that is such a good place to end things. Things are going to improve. They have something to strive for now. But now, our place in their story is over. Will they make it back to Shenandoah? Will they be able to take Rafe's mom with them this time? I like to think the answer is yes, but I'm glad the author didn't think she had to spell it out for me. Which actually brings me to the big problem. This book thinks you're fucking stupid. There's this recurring thing that goes between most chapters. Not all of them, but certainly the vast majority. It's called Storyteller's Corner, and it's where Meg Schaefer grabs you by the throat and tells you things she thinks you're too stupid to understand on your own. Literally pages later, that same thing will be explained diegetically. The most egregious example I can think of is this. When we first get to Shenandoah, Rafe and Jeremy are almost immediately accosted by warrior women on horseback. Through dialogue between Jeremy and the leader of these women, we learn they're called Valkyries, and through some context clues, we can pick up that they work for the Queen, who we know to be a good guy. Then there's a Storyteller's Corner where we're told, hey, these are the Valkyries. They're the Queen's main guard. Here are their names and what they all look like. Then in the next chapter, literally like 2 pages later, they introduce themselves to Rafe and explain their whole deal, and we don't learn everyone's name, but the couple whose names we do learn are the actually vaguely important ones, rendering that entire Storyteller's Corner wholly useless. Thanks, Meg! There are 2 more that particularly boil my parsnips. The first is right after Jeremy gets shot, we get a Storyteller's Corner that's just like, "Aw, no, I'm sorry I have to do this to you." Like, girl, shut up! The other one is earlier, soon after they arrive in Shenandoah. Rafe asks Jeremy how he's lived without being able to talk to anyone about this place for 15 years. And Jeremy responds, "You don't want to know." Then immediately, we get a Storyteller's Corner that's like, if you do want to know, go ahead and read the next chapter here. If not, skip ahead to the chapter after that. I'd recommend you read this one, though. Also, if you noticed Emily disappeared from that last scene, good eye. God! So then, we get the aforementioned Jeremy POV chapter that I liked, but would have liked more without its insipid little prologue, and then the chapter after that starts with Rafe noticed Emily was missing. What fucking good was the Storyteller's Corner then? It's not telling us anything extra or useful. Nothing in any of the storyteller's corners did anything other than piss me off. Even the fucking pie recipe. That stupid little device single-handedly brought this book down from a 2.5 star to a 1 star. I can handle a lot of things. I can forgive a lot of book sins. But I will not stand for a book that thinks I'm stupid. Fuck you. God, this book made me mad. I should have liked it. I liked the premise, and all my issues aside, it was, fine. Competently written, for the most part. I think if I was, 10 years younger, I might have been into it, but it was so immature and boring and badly paced and condescending that I just can't. This book sucked. So, alright, not off to a great start here, library. Let's move on to February and see what else you've got for me. February. A Fate Inked in Blood by Danielle L. Jensen. Content warnings for explicit sexual content, for the book, not the review, spousal abuse, discussion of coerced sex, familial negligence, violent and somewhat graphic deaths, and misogyny, both intentional and not. Well, this was another one I hadn't heard of before, but this time it was for a very good reason. I have absolutely no interest in romantasy whatsoever. It holds no appeal for me. Romantasy is often billed as a mixing of the romance and fantasy genres, but I think that's a bit inaccurate. Romantasy is a subgenre of romance. It has the beats and tropes and character archetypes associated with romance, but the setting and overall main premise are fantasy. Or in worse cases, it's romance with fantasy set dressing. Either way, genre-wise, it's more romance than fantasy, therefore it's never really held much appeal for me. I'd rather read a fantasy with a romance in it than a romance set in a fantasy world. But I did enjoy the first 2 books of the Last Binding trilogy by Freya Marsk last year, and those are romantasy, I guess, so I was willing to at least hear this book out. I wasn't stoked about this one, though. The author is Canadian, which is neat, I guess, but hand to God, my first red flag was that she was from notoriously conservative province Alberta. Obviously, where someone lives doesn't automatically inform their politics. But boy, Well, we'll get there. A Fate Inked in Blood is the first book in the Saga of the Unfated duology. It's a Norse-inspired romantasy about Freya, a fishmonger's wife who has the blood of Helene, goddess of protection. She gets dragged into a sham marriage to the local Jarl, who's convinced she's the key to him becoming king of the whole of Skaland. She's assigned the Jarl's son Bjorn as her bodyguard and combat instructor, and they have to deal with their rampant sexual tension, as well as all the various other problems and threats coming after them. I'm going to pause real quick here and say that I do actually like the duology trend from the last few years. When I was in high school, everything had to be a trilogy because Hunger Games did that. Mostly, oops. The problem with trilogies is that oftentimes book 1 is for setup and book 3 is for conclusion, and then book 2 is left to flounder. Having only 2 books in a series excises that neatly. Theoretically. That said, that's about the only thing I actually liked in this book. God damn, this thing sucked so bad. Definitely not a great look for my first real foray into romantasy. It fails spectacularly on every conceivable level. I've rarely seen a book flop so hard from start to finish. In order to properly organize my thoughts and not just ramble for hours about how much I loathe this book, I'm going to steal a Jenny Nicholson bit and give this part of the video
Internet-friendly, numbered list.
Number 1. The characters. Freya has to be one of the stupidest characters I've ever seen. Completely unintentionally. I don't think she's meant to read as this incompetent and just plain dumb, but wow, there is not a single thought in this bitch's head that's not about how much she wants to boink her shithead love interest. Freya just genuinely never seems to think for herself. The book tries to justify this by saying it's because she was raised in a misogynistic society that doesn't think women can do much of anything outside of a few assigned gender roles, and she's been treated poorly by everyone around her for her whole life, so of course she doesn't think she can do anything. The thing is, though, the book kind of implicitly validates that point of view by never having her actually change from a passive lamenting damsel who never does anything without a man's help. That's who she is the whole entire book. She regularly misses obvious context clues. She makes wild leaps of logic that are easily disproved if you think about them for like 2 seconds. She barely even tries to formulate a plan to escape. Most of her time is spent lamenting her situation and being horny over some fucking guy. Speaking of some fucking guy, Bjorn. Let's talk about Bjorn. Can we talk about Bjorn? I'd love to talk about Bjorn. This guy was shady from jump, but Freya is stupid and can't see past the, chiseled muscles and handsome face. Is this what does it for straight women? Ladies, I am begging you to get better standards. Bjorn sucks. He is the typical negging playboy alpha hot guy that you've seen on the cover of every romance novel since the dawn of publishing. He's a big ol' hunk of beef. An incredibly suspicious hunk of beef. Seriously, Bjorn acts so weird and suspicious through this whole book, and yet it's still treated as this huge reveal at the end that he was working with the bad guy, such as there was. Like, yeah, we clocked that from his 3rd appearance. He's also just so grating to read about. Ugh. Always smarter than you, Freya. Always with a snappy comeback. Everyone always talks about how good he is in bed and how he'll sleep with anything in a skirt. He's just one of those. I think they grow them in a lab somewhere. The supporting characters are no better. Jarl Snorri and his wife Ylva are the power-hungry ruler guy and his right-hand woman, which I guess we love to see a couple with shared hobbies. Snorri just sucked ass the whole time, which was the point, but it certainly didn't make him very interesting. He spent the whole book being like, "Brr, I'm going to rule all of Skaland through force, and then I'll be king and take over Nordland too," and just didn't really have much going on outside of that. Dull character. His character traits are mean and cruel and power-hungry and nothing else. Ylva was slightly more interesting, but is a tragic case of could be a great character if the story cared about her at all. I will say I think she was the only person in the whole book I gave a shit about. She's hitched her cart to Snorri's horse and has no real choice but to be along for the ride or she'll be ruined in every sense of the term, so she's kind of had to be okay with everything he does. The scene where Snorri is going to consummate his sham marriage to Freya and she breaks down about it because he already cheated on her once was actually kind of compelling. She's the most powerful woman in the village, but in a sexist society like this, that can only really go so far. Of course, she's also an evil bitch who sucks, but she could be so interesting if Danielle L. Jensen gave one single shit about her. Mostly she's just there to be an obvious red herring. There are other characters, but none of them matter. I could tell you about Liv, the character we meet for like 2 chapters before she dies. Or Steinun, the bard that Bjorn hates. Or how about Harald, the supposed big bad of the whole book, who we see like twice, ever. None of these people are important. Accordingly, none of these people are interesting. I mean, if none of the main characters are interesting, why should the supporting cast be, right? Number 2, the names. This is a relatively minor point and incredibly subjective, but it really is so funny to me how the 2 main characters are named Freya and Bjorn. Those are the 2 most basic bitch Norse-inspired names you could possibly come up with. Top 2 results for Norse names on babynames.com ass shit. Bjorn is especially funny to me because I went to high school with a guy named Bjorn. He was in my drama class. Nice guy, that Bjorn. Nothing like this fucking guy. He plays professional hockey in Germany now, I think. Sorry to drag you into this, Bjorn. You were always a cool guy to have in the group project. Anyway, I don't really have that much else to say about the names. I just thought it was dumb and unimaginative to name the protagonist of your Norse fantasy Freya. Fucking Freya. Number 3, the magic. More accurately, the lack thereof. This was about as light as magic light gets. It just didn't feel very fantastical, I guess. The only magic that exists in this world is people getting blessed by the gods at conception, and that's it. It gives them such magic powers as magic shield, and human lie detector, and summon bigger fish. The whole thing is that magic is rare because it comes straight from the gods and is a blessing and stuff, but also it, doesn't make for intricate or even very interesting world building. Like, okay, when Bjorn was conceived, not born, conceived, remember this for later, Tyr offered a drop of his blood, and now he can summon a magical fire axe that burns everything except him. Okay? Neat. What else you got? Well, there's runes? Runic magic, I guess? The only person we really see use it is Ylva. A decently big deal is made about this, since as far as I can tell, it's the only kind of non-god magic in this setting, and it makes Freya distrustful of her, but it feels like it's just there to make certain plot points happen, rather than because it adds anything to the world. Well, that and because it's Norse, so you gotta have runes. The thing here is that for as little as it really adds to the story, you could have just made Ylva god-touched or whatever too, and not had this whole other thing that only exists for Ylva, and that's it. There are a couple minor plot points that would need rewrites, but overall it would make for more consistency because the rune magic thing really doesn't matter. I know it seems like I'm complaining that there's only one type of magic and then saying that the other type of magic doesn't matter. I know. But it's because that's how the book feels. Runic magic doesn't count. It's barely its own thing. It's just a cool, mildly sinister thing Ylva can do. Everyone else we see doing magic is god-touched in some way. Fucking commit, Danielle. Number 4, the writing. Holy shit, I think the editor was asleep at the wheel on this one, guys. One of the things you're taught in literally elementary school language class here in Ontario is that when you're writing fiction, you always start a new paragraph when a new character speaks. This is pretty basic English writing stuff. I guess they must not teach them that in Alberta because I lost track of how many times this book forgot to do that. It'd be like, blah blah blah, character said. I had some kind of internal reaction or thought about this. Blah blah, I replied. And this isn't even the most egregious example of the bad writing in this book. It just sucks to read on a basic level. Everything is so dumb and corny and stupid and basic. Freya will just think the same handful of things on a loop, and occasionally something else will be thrown in temporarily for flavor. A bay leaf of a thought. The witty banter in this book is just overwritten "that's what she said" jokes. Begging romance subplots to stop doing witty banter, okay? I am putting it on the shelf until we can all learn to behave. If you're going to write your love interests having sexually charged arguments, you could at least have the decency to make them entertaining. Every single one in this book was Freya making a comment and Bjorn making the most obvious sex joke that a 15-year-old would think of, and Freya's face would flame with embarrassment and just repeat ad nauseum. And then, as for the actual romantic lines, don't worry, book talkers, we've got the panty-soaking line you want. You are mine, born in fire, and I am yours, even if only the two of us know it. Okay, basic. You got anything else in the back? It is hard to keep one's wits when faced with a woman as beautiful as the sight of shore to a man who has been lost at sea. Oh my god, are you for real with this?
Cringe. There's no other word for it. This makes me cringe. It's embarrassing.
This is it? For real? This is the best you've got for me? This is that shitty eyes on me, little beast, I've come to make you damp TikTok bullshit. Or wait, they're Norse, so it's more like, eyes on me, little beast, I am here to make you damp. Everything in this book is totally overwritten and annoying to read, or extremely basic and boring to read. There's no in-between, just awful on all counts. Number 5, the plot. Okay, I guess we should get into the meat and potatoes here. I'm not going to give a full beat-by-beat plot summary since we'd be here all day, but what I will say is this. Everything that happens in this book is stupid, boring, predictable, or some combination thereof. The meet cute is stupid. The fight to the death that Snorri makes Freya and Bjorn do is boring and stupid. Freya kills her abusive husband, which is kind of cool, but all the reactions after are stupid and predictable. Freya turns out to have the blood of 2 gods, which is predictable. Freya has been the most specialist girl in the whole world the entire book. Everyone wants Freya in some way, shape, or form. It's trying to do something with that in the interest of fairness. Like, Snorri and Ylva want her for power, her parents and brother initially want her to keep her brother safe, and later for the positions of influence they end up with due to her position with Snorri. Steinund the Bard wants her story, random villagers want her to bring forth the prophecy, King Harald wants her to make Nordland stronger or something. The idea is that Bjorn is the only one who doesn't want anything from her. But that isn't even true. Not only does he definitely want to bang her, like it's not even trying to be subtle, but also he wants her to help Nordland. Everyone wants a piece of Freya, and it's exhausting to read about. This character is a novelty doormat that growls when you step on it. There's nothing to her. She's vapid and dull and just completely uninteresting as a protagonist. But the book is constantly telling us to kiss her feet because don't we understand? She's the coolest and most bestest girl ever? She also, and this kills me, at the end of the book, finally decides to run away with Bjorn. Great. Wonderful. Happy for them. After pages and pages of nothing happening and lame-ass plot cul-de-sacs, I was glad that someone was finally making any kind of decision, even if it was basically Bjorn making the choice for Freya, but whatever. They fake their own deaths and run off to bang in a cave. And the thing that really grates my parmesan here is that at the start of the book, Freya is a free spirit who resents pretending to be tamed, who wants adventure in the great wide somewhere, who wants to go become a fighter like her father and brother. By the end of the book, she wants to go run away to some pastoral cottagecore fantasy, and Bjorn's talking about how beautiful she would look swollen with his child, and like, ugh! Go take your breeding kink somewhere else, Danielle. I swear to God, that's the only kink a certain brand of cishet people are allowed to have. But yeah, the main thing here is Freya's negative character development. I don't mean that she becomes a worse person over the course of the book. That would be interesting. No, like, she starts out a strong, independent woman, if dumb as a box of rocks, who by the end of the book needs a man to help her with everything and has given up on her dream of being a cool badass. I grew up on Tamara Pierce books, okay? Song of the Lioness and Protector of the Small and Circle of Magic. This is the exact opposite of what I want to see. Number 6. The sex. I have read Transformers fanfiction that was sexier than this. Plain white rice is spicier than this. Literally some of the most boring sex I've ever read in my life. It reads like the most basic paint-by-number sex. And you might think like, oh, you're asexual, you're not the target audience, but the thing is, I spend a lot of time reading smut! I read so much smut! I love smut! Not to mention the 2 Freya Marsk books I read last year that had way more sex, and better sex too! I'm a certified smut enjoyer, but Christ, this was just dull to read. It just feels to me that if you're going to have your main characters who have been lusting after each other for 300 pages or whatever finally bang it out, there's just more interesting ways to write about it than this. You know? It's all very basic, like I said. That really is the best word to describe the sex in this book. It's basic. You could swap the names to be any other characters and it would read the same way. And that's so boring to me. Sex scenes are a really fun opportunity to do some character work, and this book squanders that. It's meant to feel like this boiling point has finally been reached, and oh, he pins her hands and her hair falls artfully over her breasts and blah blah blah. I don't care. I don't care. To me, sex scenes are like musical numbers. Erotica may not be my area of expertise, but I am a theater kid who was raised by a theater kid, so I do know musicals. Musical theater gets a lot of shit for songs that don't do anything. And honestly, in some cases, rightfully so. There are a not insignificant number of musicals out there where the songs are just there because it's a musical, so they've got to have songs in them. They're not moving the plot forward or telling us anything about the character's state of mind or demonstrating some kind of point about the world or whatever. I was in Bye Bye Birdie in high school, and one of the characters, Albert's overbearing mother, has a song that was cut at some point, at least in the version we were doing, called A Mother Doesn't Matter Anymore. We put it back in, and I wish to God we hadn't, because it's the very definition of the show stops dead for several minutes so a character can sing a song about nothing. And honestly, the big famous number from the show, Put on a Happy Face, is exactly the same. A dorky middle-aged man cheers up some sad teenagers who don't matter in the slightest. the song. At least that one's a fun dance number too. Bye Bye Birdie is not exactly my favorite musical ever, let's just put it that way. Compare and contrast with Fancy Meeting You Here from Lucky Stiff, a musical that like 3 people have heard of, I'm sure. Yeah, the show stops dead so Rita can sing a love song to a corpse. I swear to God that makes sense in context. But it's there to demonstrate a major character's state of mind, her turbulent relationship with Tony, the corpse who is dead because she fucking shot him, and as a reminder of her general overall characterization: passionate, hot-headed, jealous, and more than a little unhinged. Plus, by the end of the song, she's learned that yes, Tony is definitely dead and she killed him, and also, someone is carting his taxidermied corpse around Monte Carlo for some reason. Also, it absolutely bangs. It's a fantastic song in an underrated musical, and it's not even the best one. It's just the one I felt made the best comparison to A Mother Doesn't Matter anymore in this context. God, I love Rita. I would kill to play her someday. Sex scenes are the same way. One reason I enjoyed Freya Marsk's The Last Binding trilogy so much is because the sex scenes are there to do something. We get to see the progression of the relationship between Robin and Edwin, for example. We get to see Edwin tear down his own walls a little, at least around Robin, over the course of the first book, and the way he behaves over the progressing sex scenes helps demonstrate that in an intimate context. It doesn't just rely on the actions themselves being hot, at least in theory, to sell the passion and intimacy of the scene. Effective smut should have passion, yes, and sexual acts, obviously, but how the characters feel in the moment and the way that's communicated to us. Take a sex scene from A Mother Doesn't Matter Anymore to Fancy Meeting You Here. And like musical numbers can make or break a show, sex scenes can make or break a spicy romance. And unfortunately, A Fate Inked in Blood is in 1,000 little pieces. Number 7. The Norseness of it all. Something that struck me as very funny right off the bat was Bjorn's hairstyle. I know this seems like a weird opener, but stick with me for a minute. Every other man in this book has a traditional, bordering on stereotypical Norse/Viking hairstyle and beard. Long, braided hair, often blonde or red, but not always, with a long, possibly also braided beard. Not our boy Bjorn, though. Oh no. Bjorn has an undercut, a man bun, and perma-stubble. Freya describes him as having the sides of his head shaved and the rest of his hair pulled back into a short ponytail, with only the scruff of a few days' absence from a razor. So the main love interest of this Norse-inspired romance novel specifically does not have a hairstyle typical to that setting, but one that would be more attractive to a modern audience. You know. So he looks like every other modern romance protagonist on the market. The point I'm trying to make here is that that's how the whole book feels. It uses the vague idea of Viking times and the typical Renaissance fair aesthetic as a backdrop, but it doesn't do much interesting with it. It's just kind of there to make the book have its own sort of identity, to be able to say this is a Norse-inspired romantasy novel in the marketing. But when something would be unpalatable to a modern audience, or at least perceived that way, that gets hurriedly brushed aside. It makes you wonder why pick ancient Nordic society as a base at all. Why not do ancient Greece? That's seen a big surge in popularity lately, with wildly varying results. Or perhaps the Celts, or ancient Britons. Well, number 8, the tradwifery of it all. Yeah, that's right, I was building to a thesis the whole time! I'd like to start here by saying that I am not making any accusations about Danielle L. Jensen's character, opinions, political beliefs, or worldviews. I do not know her, and it's not my business. That said, there are some concerns I have with this book and the way it portrays certain topics and ideas. I'd like to return your attention to a couple things I brought up earlier. The fact that God's magic is gifted at conception, not birth. Freya's evolution from a willful wild child who wants to fight and be taken seriously into a whining damsel who just wants to retire to the countryside with her beloved husband and have his babies. The fact that it's Norse society, specifically, while also actively ignoring stuff about that when it's inconvenient. How it's constantly pointed out how sexist this society is, while also doing absolutely nothing to change or push back against that. And you'll also notice how white it all is, and how there has been zero mention, not even lip service like in The Last Dragon of the East, of any queer characters at all. This all points to a lot of very right-wing ideas. Life canonically begins at conception here, because that's when magic is gifted. This is a common right-wing talking point when it comes to abortion. Life begins at conception, so all abortion is murder. The book never outright says this, of course, but the focus on conception as the starting point for god magic is weird. Freya changes over the course of the book from a strong-minded individual who is trapped by her circumstances to a cringing, wilting damsel who just wants to be rescued by her big, strong man. She wants to go run off for a pastoral cottagecore fantasy, totally different from the pastoral cottagecore life she was living at the start of the book, because she's with the right man this time. Very empowering, extremely cool and feminist, and not at all tradwife adjacent. The closest thing we get to queer rep is the coerced sex that a god, Hel, forces Freya's parents to have in order to save Freya's older brother Geir. Yay, poly rep? It's extremely gross, which, it's meant to be. It's rape by coercion. But again, that's the only reference we get to same-gender relationships. Also, it's super weird that Freya's mom makes sure to tell her daughter that the non-consensual sex that conceived her felt really good for some reason. Hello? What the fuck was that? That is an unhinged thing to say to your daughter. And with regards to race, you can argue and bitch and moan until you're blue in the face about how there were or weren't black Vikings or Scandinavians with dark skin or whatever. But the fact of the matter is that this is a fantasy novel, not historical fiction. It doesn't matter. It doesn't fucking matter. You're working with a blank canvas for the world, and you chose not to put people of color into it. I don't care what your reasoning is. That's racist. Literally, the closest thing we get to a darker shade of pale is that Bjorn has black hair, which is mostly just to make him fit the tall, dark, and handsome archetype. Princess Weeks has a fantastic video about that trope and its interplay with race in fiction, which I will link. Plus, also, it doesn't escape my notice that a lot of far-right people love Norse stuff because of how white it is specifically. At the very least, this is a bad look. Not to mention some of the other stuff I don't even have time to get into. How there's barely any pushback against the inherent sexism and classism of this world. How the big strong man and dainty little woman trope present here plays into conservative ideals of gender. The fact that when Freya gets her super special evil hell powers, they manifest as plants. Not, skeletal hands dragging those she curses to their doom. No, it's gotta be plants, because even her super special evil hell powers have to be the divine feminine natural earth mother reconnect to the earth bullshit in some way. All of this points to a very conservative world that's been built. And this is why I brought up Alberta at the start of this section. Any one of these things taken on its own might not be that weird. It might not catch my notice at all. If none of the other stuff was there, and it was literally just God's gift, a drop of their blood at conception, I probably wouldn't register that as strange in the first place. When I first read it, I assumed it was a metaphor. People don't literally know the gods as people or anything, after all, and we can assume this is a time period where they don't really know exactly how pregnancy and conception even work. But after Freya's mom tells the story about how Freya was conceived, no, I realized they do mean literally at conception. And that's just one thing. The entire book feels so ickily stealth trad. Again, I don't know Danielle L. Jensen's character. I do not know her opinions on pretty much anything, and I don't want to know. But I feel uncomfortably certain that I could guess which party she voted for in Canada's last federal election, and that's all I'll say on that. Honestly, I have so much to say about this book still, but I'm exhausted from this crap, and you probably are too. 1 star. Fuck this book, don't read its sequel. Bad book from cover to cover. Although the cover art isn't bad, I won't lie. It's not enough to save the contents, unfortunately. So the first book was mediocre but pissed me off, and the second book almost made me quit this whole project entirely. We are 0 for 2 here, gang. Let's hope we can turn this shit around. March. The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. Okay, so funny story about this one. Literally the day I put in the order for this activity kit and went to pick it up, I was talking with a coworker, and she recommended this book to me. I have to stress that this coworker does not work at the library I get these kits from, and in no way, shape, or form has any influence over the kits. I just went to pick it up, and it happened to have the book she'd recommended to me not 6 hours ago. Magic. How the fuck? Anyway, because The Starless Sea had been recommended to me by a colleague whose opinions I generally trust, I was actually really worried. I'd hated both of the last 2 books I'd gotten from the activity kits. What if I hated this one too? Would I have to lie to her face and say I totally loved it when I actually really disliked it and thought it was a slog? Thankfully that didn't happen because I actually really loved this book. Like a lot. The Starless Sea is about Zachary Ezra Rollins, a young man who finds a book at his university library where he features as a character, sort of, and his life kind of unravels from there. He spends a lot of time trying to uncover the mystery of the Starless Sea, both before and after he gets to it. It's written in a style that flows nicely, keeping you engaged and constantly thinking until the last page. Interspersed between regular chapters are excerpts from various in-universe books. Some are short stories, some are chapters of longer books, and some are something else entirely. The book opens with 2 of these before introducing Zachary, and honestly at first I thought it was going to be pretentious nonsense. That passed quickly, though. Once there have been a couple chapters of Zachary's plotline, you really start to get into it, and the interspersed stories do come back later and are actually very important overall. I don't want to go into too much detail about this one, because I think you should read it yourself, if you haven't. It's fascinating, compelling, smart, funny, tragic, sweet, creepy, and so much more, and it works scarily well. A lot of the book, especially towards the end, had an almost dreamlike quality to it, which felt very appropriate. My colleague described it to me as word soup, but it works, and I have to agree with her on that one. Once I got into it, and admittedly it did take me a bit, it's kind of a slow start, it was hard to put down. Reading it on breaks at work was hard but necessary because I had to find out more. A problem that I often find with stories about stories is that they have a tendency to huff their own farts about it. The Lost Story was a pretty prime example of this. The Starless Sea doesn't really have that issue. True, it's definitely married to the idea of humans loving stories, which, yeah, we do, but it didn't feel pretentious about it. I'd been really worried about that, especially when I found out that Zachary was writing his thesis on narrative in video games. I was so anxious that at some point he was going to have his mind opened to the fact that books are actually the superior storytelling vessel, but no, that never happened, thank God, to be honest. I love books and reading. I mean, look at what my job is. But book people are some of the most obnoxious people on the planet sometimes, especially in books about books. I love video games too, though, especially in the way Zachary talks about them, how they have the potential to tell stories in ways that other mediums can't. The example that comes to mind most readily for me is Ghost Trick, my favorite video game of all time, that wouldn't work in any other medium in my opinion. Anyway, I just loved the way this book talked about stories. Not in an inherent value of reading way, but in the way of people have always been people, and people have always loved stories, and always will, and that's wonderful. A celebration of the way people connect with each other through stories. It was a genuine delight. The one minor issue I had with it was the love stories. I felt they were more told to us than shown. Zachary and Dorian's romance was the most this for me, but the thing is that The Starless Sea isn't really a love story. It has a love story in it, but that's not what it's about. So it's a bit lighter on the details there. I don't know, I didn't mind it as much here as I did in the other books I read for this video, some of which I've talked about and some of which I'll get to. Also, there's a whole thing where all of Zachary's chapters begin with his full name, Zachary Ezra Rollins, and after a few chapters of this, I had the thought that at some point there was going to be a chapter that didn't start with that, and it would make me lose my mind. And, I love being right about things. I am the smartest princess in the whole universe. 5 stars. Read The Starless Sea. Of all the books I read for this video, this one was my favorite. Again, I don't want to talk about it too much because I want you to read it. Experience this book for yourself. It's worth it. April. The Sky on Fire by Jen Lyons. Content warning for non-explicit sexual content, implied attempted sexual assault, general violence, blood and gore, and themes of consent and abuse throughout. This was the only book in this video that I'd not only heard of before, but that had actually already been on my TBR for months before getting it from the activity kit. I'd seen it on the news shelf at work and fallen in love with the cover. I mean, look at it, that's beautiful. I would buy a print of that and frame it on my wall. The premise hooked me in too. A fantasy heist where they're stealing from a dragon's hoard and the last person to supposedly steal from her gets dragged in for one last job? Hell yes, sold. Sign me up, yum 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 yum. And I'd even scanned the first page or so, and the writing quality seemed good. All told, I was stoked to see this book in my bag and excited to get reading. That is to say, this book should have been totally perfect for me. I wish I'd loved it. Don't get me wrong, it's not bad. It's a fairly solid middle-of-the-road book. The heist plot is fun and interesting. The world of dragons and dragon riders and the relationship between them is cool and well done. Some of the late-game twists and reveals really made me sit up and go, "Oh yeah, right, fuck yeah!" The writing was competent. Not good. I had a lot of gripes with it, and it was certainly not as fanciful as the Starless Sea or anything, but leagues better than A Fate Inked in Blood. I definitely didn't hate it. But the issue is that I should have loved it, and instead just think it was fine, mostly. Honestly, there are 3 big problems that keep me from fully loving it: the characters, the pacing, and the horniness. Let's start with the characters. Most of them were nothing. Pretty one-note, one-trick ponies. Anarad, our protagonist, was smart, resourceful, and exceptionally dull. She only started caring about anything when she found out she had a brother, and her sole motivation became keeping him alive and out of danger. This occurs about halfway through the book. Reese, the main love interest, had a bit more going on, I guess, being the rider of the oldest dragon alive, but her main traits were secretive and charming, and she didn't feel very deep for the most part either. Of the main characters, the one who grew on me the most was Claw, honestly. Yeah, she was also a one-trick pony, with her one trick being violence, but I enjoyed her for the most part. I like a violent woman. There were several characters who were ostensibly in the main cast that I regularly forgot about. There's one guy, Kybren, who spoke exclusively in in-universe quotations from plays, which was a choice. Okay, in Bionicle, stick with me here, in Bionicle there's a character named Velica, who only speaks in riddles and parables that have to get translated by others. The thing about Velica is that he was an extremely minor character who we stopped caring about very quickly, except right towards the end when Greg Farshty, in his infinite wisdom, decided Velica was secretly a god or whatever. Kybren is supposed to be part of the main crew, but he always ends up feeling like a weird hanger-on because he never has anything to actually add to the conversation. I feel like if he spoke a different language, that would be one thing, but it feels like he's just supposed to be quirky. He dies during the heist, and I felt absolutely nothing. I felt sadder for Claw losing her best friend than I did about the fact that he died. There's also Nairon, who doesn't die, but also just straight up disappears from the book. Constantly. His thing is that he's the quiet one. He rarely talks and spends a lot of time on his own. Consequently, I frequently forgot he existed, and had to be reminded of who he was whenever he showed up. Towards the end, when they get to the super secret jungle city or whatever where he and Reese live, he just ditches the crew to go find his family and isn't seen again for the rest of the book. They briefly mention him at the very end, and that's it. Genuinely, I don't even remember his role on the team. At least Kybren was there to be good at runes or whatever. No idea what Nairon's deal was, because he was that unmemorable. That's kind of the main issue with a lot of these characters. They're not memorable. They don't stick with you. These are not Blorbo from my shows material. They are heist team archetypes with quirks. Not exactly making for compelling characters is what I'm getting at. And don't even get me started on the dragons. They're just as dull. I love dragons. These ones just have the same problem as the human characters. They're ankle deep and boring to read about. As to the pacing, it's completely all over the place. We start out right in the middle of things, and there's some neat fights and stuff, and then a big jungle escape that somehow feels both fast-paced and like it drags on forever. And then Anarod gets kidnapped by the heist crew, and then escapes, and gets on an airship, and then gets kidnapped back, then agrees to the heist, and then everything slams to a halt for a huge chunk of the book. It's breakneck, and then slower than molasses in January, seemingly at random. Anarod gets kidnapped at least 3 or 4 times, and no, cracking wise about it doesn't make it any less stupid or obvious that you're reusing plot points or make her character seem less incompetent. It's lame. There's a huge amount of faffing about in the middle where they're just putting things in motion for the heist. I appreciate that the vast majority of heist stories are going to be prep and setup, but it felt like nothing happened for long stretches, punctuated by insane spurts of activity. And that ending, oh my god. Everything happens so much. It's going at a breakneck pace, which for once I don't mind. The heist itself was quite good, and everything that happens after? Honestly, I really liked. Things were moving, parts were falling into place, it was great. But I kept looking at the remaining page count going, how are they going to have time to wrap all this up and give us a proper denouement in this amount of pages? The answer is they didn't. There is no falling action, there is no denouement. The closest we get is an epilogue that made me roll my eyes so hard I nearly hurt myself. But no. The book climaxes and then just stops. You couldn't spare, 5 pages? We had to waste time kidnapping Anarod over and over? Okay. And the final big yikes for me, the horniness. This world is trying very hard to be queer normative, which I can certainly appreciate. A male character's husband or a female character's wife are mentioned with casualness, trans people are just a normal everyday part of the world, no one blinks twice at the idea of a poly relationship. It's nice. More of that, please. The garden rings were extremely off-putting, though. As an asexual myself, I'm no stranger to the idea of using rings as a way to communicate sexuality, and I know things like the hanky code exist. But everyone in this world wears rings decorated with flowers and plants that represent their sexuality, their relationship status, their kinks, to literally everyone. No, the fact that there's a prefer not to say option doesn't make it less weird. Maybe it would be less weird if Anarod didn't point out the sexual proclivities of every character she ever meets. I don't care that the random merchant they talk to one time likes getting his hair pulled or whatever. Stop telling me about the kinks of people I don't know. I loved the idea of social rings, though, I'll say that. Credit where it's due, that does feel like a natural extension of the idea of wedding rings. Rings that say your relationship status, your gender and pronouns, your general station, all with a glance at your hand. I like that. I just wish it wasn't weirdly sexual and, like I said, constantly pointed out with every new character. That's only one small part of it, though. This book is so weird about sex. Anarod and Rhys are instantly in lust, and sex is brought up all the time. It feels like yet another case of bringing up sex makes it edgy and for adults, or whatever. Eventually Sicarian gets in on it too, an old flame of Anarod's and a major character in his own right, and the three of them form a boring little polycule. Good for them, I guess. The romance in this book is non-existent and feels told to us rather than shown. But anyway, the point here is that the only time anyone actually has sex in this book is a fade to black drunk sex scene between those three. I genuinely laughed out loud when I got there. Like, really? For all your horny bullshit, you're not actually going to write the sex? Pathetic. Except then later at one point, Anarod talks in explicit and graphic detail about tying Rhys up and doing dom sub things with her, and that felt more like a sex scene than anything. It was weird. Rhys got super horny about it and basically came untouched. The whole thing was more uncomfortable than anything. Like, I felt weirder reading that than I did about the actual explicit sex in A Fate Inked in Blood. Although I will say that I'm more confident in Jen Lyon's ability to write a proper explicit sex scene that won't make my eyes glaze over than I am in Danielle L. Jensen. But wait, there's more! There's a really weird and uncomfortable moment early on when Anarod meets the dragon Tiendromos for the first time, speaking through the body of his rider Jaime. He gives himself claw hands through dragon magic, not important, and shoves her against a wall to snarl in her face. Okay, normal, yes. Pissed off evil dragon doing a threat display. Cool, I'm with you so far. Then Tiendromos is looking at her lustfully. Anarod's narration specifically points this out as strange because dragons have very different beauty standards from humans, so there's no way Tiendromos would find her attractive. Specifically, she says it would be like a human lusting after an ant. This is the point where I pause and say that most rape and sexual assault have nothing to do with sexual attraction. It's all about power and control. That could have been what this scene was going for, but one, it doesn't really read that way, and two, this only happened because Anarod is a woman. If it had been a man getting pinned to a wall and threatened by a big fuck-off dragon, would there be this sexual element to it? I'm pretty confident in saying no. I'm a big hater of the idea that all violence towards women must include a sexual element, because it's one that comes up all the time in fiction. When a man is being violent and threatening towards a woman, he can't just threaten to cut her throat, he also has to threaten to rape her as well. It serves to perpetuate the idea of women as inherently sexual beings and the perpetual victims of inherently violent men, even in cases like this, where she's perfectly capable of defending herself against this specific sort of assault. She pulls a knife on him and everything. Once Jaime has his body back, he's immediately horrified and apologetic, saying that Tiendromos would never, displaying that yes, the intent was absolutely for this scene to read as potential sexual assault. And I had the sinking feeling that this was going to go one of two ways. One, this was a Chekhov's gun that was going to fire at some point. Either Tiendromos was going to actually attempt to sexually assault Anarod later, or Jaime was going to develop some kind of jealousy at not being invited to the polycule and attempt it himself, in a Tiendromos wouldn't, but I would kind of way. Or two, this was never going to come up again and was going to be completely pointless. Place your bets! It was two. It was two! Nothing came of this ever. This could have been cut completely, and it would change nothing. You can still have Anarod pull a knife on Jaime and hold it to his groin. There's a lot of sensitive, unprotected meat down there. It makes sense as a place to attack first, especially if you're trying not to draw attention to the fact that you're armed by raising your hand with a knife in it. But why put this sexual element into the scene at all? Like I said, I think it's partially because no violence can happen to women in fiction without a sexual element to it, and also because sexual assault is edgier, somehow. Not a fan of that in the slightest. God, I don't want to make it seem like I outright hated this book. I didn't. A lot of the time, it was a really fun read. The actual heist scene was appropriately tense and exciting. The twists and the climax were a lot of fun. It has themes of consent and coercion and cohabitation and resistance against tyranny that I actually really loved. Anarod's conflicted feelings about the parents who literally threw her away were interesting. But the big problems are big, and they really drag the book down. I'd give it 3 stars. Not bad, but not fantastic either. 3 stars to me is where I'd feel comfortable putting my name on it for the staff picks shelf at work if there was nothing else available, but if a friend asked me if I'd liked it, I'd be non-committal about it. It's fine enough that I wouldn't be opposed to checking out other books Jen Lyon has written, but bad enough that I'm not rushing to add them to my TBR anytime soon. May. Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare. Content warnings according to Storygraph. Graphic violence, death, and child death, moderate alcohol, sexual assault, and misogyny, and minor rape, parental death, and vomit. I am not gonna lie to you guys, this is the only book for this video that I straight up did not finish reading. The amount of actual dread I felt on seeing this book in my kit was insane. I've never read a Cassandra Clare book before, but I have skimmed the openings of a couple and roasted them with my brother while browsing at chapters. I have zero interest in her or her books. All I really know about her is that she was a big-name Harry Potter fan back in the day, she got her start writing HP fanfic, I think she got in shit for plagiarizing in her HP fanfic, and her early books were edgy Draco Hermione fanfic with the serial numbers filed off. That's about it. Absolutely none of that is my scene, so I've avoided her. Plus, from my admittedly small sample size of skimming her books, I just didn't think her writing was very good. But I was determined to be fair. Swordcatcher is, I believe, her first adult novel, and at least one of her first books outside of her main Shadowhunters series. It is also over 600 pages long. I decided that I would read at least the first 200. That's about a third of the book. I figured that's around the length of This Is How You Lose the Time War and a couple other shorter books I've read. If nothing else, I could give this book the old college try. I gave up around page 70. Nothing happened for pages and pages at a time. By the time I quit, over 10% of the way through, we hadn't even had an inciting incident. All we'd gotten was a 30-page prologue and a basic introduction to our main leads. That's it. For most of this video, I've avoided doing a beat-by-beat plot summary of these books because that's not what I felt like doing for them. With Swordcatcher, though, I feel pretty good about doing one because I read so little of it and so little happens. Let's go! The prologue introduces our main male character, a boy named Kel, and sets up the basic premise of his relationship with Prince Connor. Kel is an orphan boy who looks vaguely like the prince, so he's taken from his orphanage and magicked up to look like Connor, then sat at a fancy dinner party and told to pretend to be him. Then he's asked to do this for the rest of his life, to become at once body double and bodyguard, the Swordcatcher, hence the title. For some reason, this takes 30 pages. An entire 5% of the book is spent on this. When I was a kid, I read a book called The Whipping Boy by Sid Fleischman. It's about an orphaned boy who takes the corporal punishment meant for the crown prince. It opens with the prince misbehaving and the whipping boy taking the punishment in his place. We didn't need a 30-page backstory about the whipping boy getting picked out at an orphanage and scrubbed and tubbed and fed and paraded around in all the pomp and circumstance. What did this add? The most I can say is that during the dinner, Kel learns a bunch about the various noble families of Castellane, but I'd argue that a skilled writer could have found literally any other way to give the readers this information that didn't involve a 30-page backstory and exposition dump. Also, the whipping boy isn't even 90 pages long. God, getting back on track. After this long, drawn-out prologue that could have been half the page count and still too long, in Chapter 1, we get a time skip to Kel and Connor's adulthood. Kel has grown up alongside Connor, with everyone thinking they're cousins, and frequently appears in public pretending to be Connor if they think Connor is in potential danger. They go to a big festival that's for the anniversary of Castellane's freedom as a city-state, or whatever, while discussing Connor's potential future suitors. They're told a guy was just arrested for carrying a crossbow in public, and so as to take no chances with the prince's safety, Kel has to give his speech instead. He does. Nothing goes wrong. Kel and Connor leave to go to a brothel. End Chapter 1.
Riveting!
Chapter 2 is our first introduction to our female lead, Lynn, and her best friend, Miriam, which threw me for the biggest loop, let me tell you, because that's my name, but spelled differently. I mean, I'll give the book this, I never see my name in anything, so that was the novelty, I guess. Lynn is a healer, but also an Ashkar, which is an ethnicity, I think? They're an oppressed minority, is the main point, forced to live in slums at the outskirts of the city, hated by pretty much everyone else. I'll talk more about that in a bit, but the point is that Liv has two main points against her. She's Ashkari, which means everyone outside of her community thinks she's the scum of the earth, and she's a woman, which means that even her own people don't take her seriously as a physician. We're introduced to the two of them as Liv is trying to haggle with a shop owner for a medicine book, which he won't sell to her because she is, again, an Ashkar and a woman. She complains about this to Miriam, who is the entire reason why she's studying medicine in the first place. Miriam has some kind of chronic illness that's slowly killing her, and Liv is trying to save her life. Alright, a protagonist with a motivation, thank God. I'll take what I can get right now. They start to head home because they have to get back to their part of the city before curfew, but accidentally wind up in the main square where Kella's Connor is giving a speech. While there, Miriam collapses. Liv freaks out, but her uncle, the only Ashkar allowed to serve the royal family, sends them a cart to take them home. End Chapter 2.
Riveting!
I got about 2 pages into Chapter 3, wherein Kel and Connor are still riding horses to a brothel, before realizing that this book was making me miserable, and I quit to go read Thornhedge by T. Kingfisher instead. In my book journal, I described it as nothing happens very slowly, and I stand by that. There's no reason that the events as I described them above should have taken over 70 pages. Every sentence is overwritten garbage that makes it feel like Cassandra has thesaurus.com open in another tab at all times. Like, okay, take this extremely good first impression from the first fucking page. His name was Aristide Jolivet, and as he lifted his hand to rap sharply on the door of the orphanage, the large, square-cut amethyst on his left hand gleamed in the light of the moon. Etched into it was a lion, the symbol of the city. It appeared to be roaring. This section is being told to us by an impartial third-person narrator, as none of our actual POV characters have been introduced yet. This is a weird detail to focus on, and an even weirder way to write it. The way that first sentence is structured calls closer attention to the amethyst, an incidental detail, than to the presumably actually important named character. This amethyst is never mentioned again, by the way, at least not in the first 70 pages. The only reason I can guess as to why it's written like this is because Cassandra Clare was writing while picturing the movie adaptation. In a movie, this wouldn't be an odd shot. We'd see a wide shot of the orphanage, some mid-shots of Jolivet approaching the door, and a close-up of his hand knocking, so we can see that lion rampant carved into it. And then later, we'd see in other shots that same lion image, letting us intuit that it's the symbol of the city, and that Jolivet works for the city. The whole thing would take approximately 10 seconds, and wouldn't feel out of place or jarring at all. It's a sequence that works in the language of a visual medium, like film or even a graphic novel, but not one that works for prose. C-, please see me after class. Also, when discussing potential suitors for Connor and saying one has a lot of arable land, we get this. Arable land, said Connor. Never have more romantic words been spoken. So many ballads written about beautiful women with vast tracts of arable land. If that's what they're calling it now, said Kel.
Huge tracts of land?
Do you think I'm stupid, Cassandra Clare? This book is dull and unimaginative on top of just being badly written. The world building is nothing. Castellane is just fantasy Rome. What is it with fantasy authors writing low magic settings and just making a fantasy version of a real-life ancient place and culture, changing the names and calling it a day? Something 2 nickels. Like, the king here is named Marcus Aurelian. Are you kidding me? Yeah, we'll name our fantasy Rome guy Marcus Aurelian and our fantasy Norse lady Freya. Danielle L. Jensen and Cassandra Clare should team up to write the worst book ever. The Ashkari people are fantasy Jewish, and it's not subtle. I don't think subtle is a word Cassie knows. They're distrusted and discriminated against by the citizens of Castellane for having a different religion and for being the only people who can use magic. They're forced to live in a sort of slum area called the Sioux. They have to wear specific types of clothing, the types of jobs they can have are restricted, and so on. They're stereotyped as being cunning, dangerous, devious, and different. I'm not even a big history buff, but I know enough about Jewish persecution in ancient Rome, and also in general, to draw connections. Also Ashkari, Ashkenazi, once again showing that Cassandra Clare sucks at naming things. I think Swordcatcher wants to be more about politics than it does about fantasy, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's absolutely a market for that. Look at the success of A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. But Swordcatcher is so slow-paced and dull that it nearly put me to sleep, so badly written that it made me tear out my hair, and there's just way too much of it. Cassandra, learn to cut the chaff. This book made me retroactively wonder if I'd been too harsh on The Sky on Fire. I don't feel right giving it a proper star rating since I did read so little of it, but if I was going to, I'd give it 1 star. No, actually fuck that, 0 stars. This book sucks so bad, don't waste your time. And if you're going to come at me saying, oh, you can't judge a book that early on, you're missing out on the part where it gets good. Ko-fi.com/magicalgirlmascot. Give me money. I'm not putting myself through more of this shit on my own time for free. June, The Fox Wife by Yang Tzi Chu. Content warnings for death, child death, cultural misogyny, sex work, and sexual harassment. Another one I'd never heard of. This is a good thing since that was the whole point of this exercise in the first place. When it comes right down to it, I really don't know that many books. This was another one that I really enjoyed. It takes place in Manchuria, what's now northern China, in 1908. It's told in dual POVs between Snow, a fox in the form of a woman, written in first-person past tense, and Bao, a human detective, written in third-person present tense. Snow is looking for vengeance on the man who caused her father's death, a photographer named Baektu Nikan. Bao starts out investigating a seemingly unrelated death and winds up trying to track down Snow. The two storylines intersect towards the end as everything falls into place. These sort of crossing storyline novels do interest me, but I've never found one that doesn't sound like the sort of book club book that my mom would read, you know? I'm sure they're out there, I just haven't found them. I liked both Snow and Bao quite a bit, as well as Tagta and most of the other supporting characters. Shiro was awful, although he was meant to be. Snow was my favorite, sharp and cunning, but easily pulled into things by her temper. I was sympathetic to her revenge quest. I love seeing terrible men get killed, but also understood why she hesitated at the last minute. Unfortunately, it did have an air of keeping her more pure because she's female. I know there were Watsonian reasons for it, but from a Doyleist perspective, it was a bit off-putting. Let women kill! The book had the vibe of being a bit more of a historical mystery novel than a fantasy, since the magic was relatively low-key. I love a mystery, so this wasn't a problem for me. It's always a good time figuring out how the pieces fit together. In a good mystery, even if you figure out one aspect of it, there's always something else you might have overlooked. But when you think back on it, all the clues were there. That's how The Foxwife was for me. I figured pretty early on that Shiro was the one who caused the death of Feng, the courtesan that Bao is originally investigating. I also figured out that Kuro was Snow's husband several chapters before that was revealed. However, I didn't figure out that Snow's old lady was Tagta, Bao's childhood friend and crush, until she brought him up. I also didn't figure out what happened to Baektu Nikan until that was revealed. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy, in my opinion. I liked the historical setting a lot, too. I don't know much in the way of Chinese history, but I felt like the more important aspects were explained well enough that even I could understand. It didn't feel like I was attending a lecture on Chinese history interspersed with a magical detective story either. Information about the setting was woven in and explained without being overwhelming. As mentioned, this one was lighter on the magical elements again. A lot of magic light fantasies in this video, more than I generally read. I liked this one more than the other two, though. For one, it was actually competently written, and for another, there was a real mythological air to it. A fate inked in blood wishes its vibes were as immaculate as this. The Foxwife is about human and non-human, magical and mundane, how they oppose each other and what happens when they mix. It uses its setting and its magic system to be about something, which I always love to see. Unfortunately, I do find the book meanders a bit. There were several times where I thought the book would be drawing to some kind of natural conclusion, but we still had several dozen pages left. It had a slow pace, not as bad as Swordcatcher, but I still felt like it dragged in a few places. There were a few parts I had to convince myself through. Not many, but they were there. Overall, I liked The Foxwife a whole lot. In the end, I gave it 4 stars. It's a good, solid read with likable, sympathetic characters, an engaging story, and a beating human heart. From poking around online, I've seen a lot of people saying that Yang Xichu's previous book, The Night Tiger, is better than this one, so that's been added to my TBR. This is fantastic. That was half the reason I wanted to do this whole little project in the first place. So what have we learned from this experience? Well, I've learned that picking books at random definitely pushes me out of my comfort zone. I wouldn't have picked up the vast majority of these if they hadn't been randomly selected for me. Even the ones that I already knew probably wouldn't have gotten read for at least another few months or so, if at all. I'd set out on this little project with the idea of reading books I wouldn't otherwise pick up, and that's exactly what happened. Something else I've learned is that Sturgeon's law holds true. 90% of everything is crap. Of the 6 random books I read, 2 were excellent, 2 were mediocre but pissed me off, and 2 were terrible. Okay, so that's more like 66.66666% of everything is crap, but my point stands. Picking stuff out at random is a good way to find things that are new to you, for sure, but it's also a really good way to find garbage. Exhibits A and B. However, I think that's still valuable. Reading books you don't like or checking out media you end up thinking is dog shit is good for you, in my opinion. You don't have to like everything. Doing this kind of analysis of things I disliked was helpful in better understanding art and writing. It was definitely worthwhile. But also I think I'm totally justified in quitting partway through a book that was making me miserable. Don't waste your time on Swordcatcher. But also, reading part of it made me understand why I don't like Cassandra Clare outside of just, I've heard she's not very good. The thing I hope you've learned today is that library workers are not immune to having shit taste in books. Myself included. If there was a book in this video that you had a different opinion of than me, that's okay. I am not some kind of paragon of literature because of where I work. I know a lot of library people, and let me tell you, we have taste as wide and varied as anyone else. I know a lot of library people who don't read, period. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Not that I think the people picking out books for my activity kits were specifically choosing books that they thought were good or anything. I mentioned briefly at the start of the video that the library that does these also does bundles of 5 to 7 books at a time. One of my libraries also does these, so I've collected books for them before. Let me tell ya, the only thought going into pulling books for a bundle is, does this fit the genre, and is usually no more than a cursory glance at a genre spine label. It would absolutely shock me if that wasn't the process here. That said, I know for a fact I have at least one colleague who's ride or die for a fate inked in blood. So, like I said, librarians are not immune to having shit taste in books. Will I continue getting these kits in the future? Maybe later. I'm taking a break from them for at least the summer to focus on the summer reading challenge they're hosting this year. Once that's done, I'll probably do a video on it as well. But I found that I really only had time to read my monthly book, and not much else while doing my self-imposed challenge here. I want to get through a bit more of my TBR this summer, hence the summer reading challenge at my local library. Check out, your local library today and see if they're doing anything special for the summer. In my experience, most places are. Thank you so much for watching. Have you read any of these books? Let me know in the comments. Please also let me know if there were any here you'd like me to do a more in-depth analysis of. Except Swordcatcher. Again, that's ko-fi.com/magicalgirlmascot. Or if you have any book recommendations for me. My TBR is long, but it can always be longer. There are so many good books out there in the world, and clearly I don't know all of them. Recs are always appreciated. If you liked this video, please consider liking and subscribing. If you didn't like this video, well, tough luck, I guess. Catch you in the next one.